All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this episode of Tutors, where we are starting a new unit today on evolution, and we are going to begin this one with natural selection. Let us begin. Learning targets of the day. The first one is to define what evolution actually is. What does it mean when we say evolution? And next, then we're going to describe the process of natural selection. What's actually going on and how does natural selection work? But before we get too far, quick question, which is, what is evolution? Because evolution gets thrown around as a term a lot. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't actually know what evolution means, and they think it means a lot more than it actually does. Evolution means change. It's talking about how organisms change over time. Some people think that evolution has a lot to do with how life began upon this planet. But unfortunately, how life began on this planet goes beyond the realms of science. What evolution actually compares is that life on Earth changes compared to another idea, which was the immutability of species, that life on Earth doesn't change. These competing ideas have been around for an extremely long period of time. In fact, Aristotle was one of the individuals who was a proponent of the immutability of species. One of the issues that people who believed in evolution always had, one of the problems that they always had, is they couldn't answer the question, why would life change? What could cause life on this planet to actually change? And that was a big question for many, many, many years. Which leads us to what we know today, that evolution does happen as a change in the allele frequency, a change in the genetics of a population. We know that the origin of alleles is through mutations, which immediately with a mutation and a new allele being present, that means that we would have a change in our allele frequency. But evolution is not directed. There is no pinnacle to evolution. An organism can also not cause itself to change. If a pesticide is used on a field, that doesn't cause the formation of a pesticide-resistant strain of that insect. That insect would have had some organisms in its population that were already resistant to that pesticide. The pesticide only killed the organisms that weren't resistant, allowing the pesticide-resistant insects to continue to reproduce and thus have offspring and survive. If the insects didn't have a natural resistance to that pesticide, they would have all just died out. The pesticide is not going to cause them all of a sudden to get the mutation, to gain an allele that allows them to survive. They would have already needed to have had that allele present within their population. The insects would have had some individuals in their population already expressing the phenotype of being resistant to that specific pesticide. The only objective, in a sense, is survival of the species. If the organism doesn't have the ability to survive, if it doesn't have the ability to have offspring, in other words, that means that its alleles would disappear. Those genes that it had would no longer exist within the population. And if enough of the organisms didn't survive, that would lead to extinction. Which gets us to natural selection, which is the answer to why organisms would change. Because nature changes. It changes slowly, but this earth is a dynamic, changing system. It is not the same today as it was even yesterday. It is constantly changing. And those changes, though might be imperceptible to us, they, over a long period of time, can have very large effects. And because of that, that means that some organisms are going to have traits that allow them to survive as the environment changes. Those traits are favorable. Those traits are good. And their alleles will then increase in their frequency because more of the individuals with those particular traits are going to survive and do well. The species that don't end up fitting that new environment, the species that don't have those traits, or the organisms that don't have those favorable traits will end up dying off and being unable to have offspring, and their alleles then will disappear. Organisms cannot choose to fit in their new environment. Organisms cannot decide to change. Organisms can't evolve at all. You can't evolve, and I can't evolve. The only thing that can evolve is populations over generations. Populations over generations can have a change in their allele frequency. But it's not because they decided to do it. There was an idea many years ago that organisms would inherit the characteristics that their parents acquired over their lifetime. In other words, if a giraffe stretched its neck a little bit to reach up higher into the trees, then its newly stretched neck would then mean its offspring would have a slightly longer neck. We know that today to be completely incorrect. We understand that the changes that an organism might undergo throughout its life do not necessarily impact its genetics and thus would have no impact upon its offspring. Random mutations cause new alleles to be formed, and nature, the environment around the organism, is going to determine whether or not those new alleles are good or bad. One of the clues that we see for natural selection is actually what we have done for many, many, many years in agriculture with artificial selection, where we have actually taken different organisms and we have modified them over many years by breeding the specific type that we wanted with another of that same type. This is how we have actually generated corn. Corn comes from a plant that is called teosinte. Teosinte looks almost like wheat. It doesn't look anything like corn. Over many, many years of us breeding the starchiest and the plumpest of these grains, we end up forming corn. We also have this with wild cabbage, which is the foundation of broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and kohlrabi and a few other vegetables. That's all from just breeding wild cabbage for specific traits, whether it's for the florets or whether it is for the leaves or whether it is for the stem. That is how we have actually generated these different plants. They all come from the same original type of plant. And because we have chosen specific alleles that are favored, specific traits that are favored, we have been able to develop different varieties of these organisms. And that just shows that if a trait is favored and those organisms are able to reproduce, then that can have an impact upon the allelic frequency of a population. So in summary of all this, first, variation, remember, it's due to mutations that are going to occur in our DNA. And the organisms, they can't choose to change. Whether it's artificial selection or it's natural selection, it doesn't make a difference. The organisms, the populations, aren't what's making the decision to change. It is an outside factor that is pushing those organisms to change, for some alleles to be favored and other alleles to be disfavored. Some alleles will be inherited into the next generation, whereas other alleles will disappear from that population because those organisms with those alleles will not be able to reproduce and they will not have offspring, thus not passing on their alleles. That is how natural selection works. There is a change in allele frequency in organisms. So we can observe that evolution takes place. And until next time, be awesome, stay awesome.